The chamber of the House Ethics Committee was not merely a room, it was a coliseum, and Nancy Pelosi had cast herself as its reigning Caesar. The air, thick with the collective breath of a hand-picked audience, vibrated with a predatory hum. This was not a hearing, it was a coronation of justice, her justice, staged for the ravenous eye of the camera. She stood at the lectern, a figure carved from decades of unyielding power, her gaze a physical weight pressed upon the man seated before her. He was the designated sacrifice, Senator John Kennedy of Louisiana. Her voice, a finely tuned instrument of political warfare, sliced through the silence. "Senator Kennedy," she began, each syllable a polished stone of condescension, "you are a relic, a charming, folksy ghost haunting the halls of progress. But this house is no longer haunted. Today, we are performing an eviction." A wave of triumphant laughter and applause surged from the gallery behind her, a loyal chorus orchestrated by her staff. They saw their queen, resplendent in a suit the color of authority, poised to deliver the killing blow. They had come for a spectacle of dominance, a public dissection, and the master surgeon was ready to make her first incision. The air was electric with the promise of a swift and brutal victory, but the sacrifice was refusing to tremble. Senator John Kennedy, the man in the path of this political hurricane, seemed utterly unmoved. He made a slow, deliberate adjustment to the simple, almost academic glasses that rested on his nose. With a plain ballpoint pen, he scribbled a note onto a yellow legal pad, a gesture so mundane, so devoid of drama, it was in itself a form of defiance. It was the motion of a man checking an item off a to-do list. The harsh glare of the television lights seemed to catch in his silver hair, creating a halo effect against the dark, imposing wood of the chamber walls. His eyes, a pale, penetrating blue, held a quiet lucidity. It was not the look of fear nor of anger. It was the calm, steady gaze of a seasoned mariner who has seen 1,000 storms and knows that the most fearsome tempests often blow themselves out. Pelosi's voice swelled, a crescendo of practiced indignation. "You wrap yourself in the mantle of the common man," she declared, her voice resonating with the passion of 1,000 stump speeches. "But you are a puppet, Senator, a marionette whose strings are pulled by the very corporate polluters who poison the bayous you claim to represent. You are not a voice for the voiceless. You are a mouthpiece for greed." The applause this time was a physical blow, a roar that seemed to shake the portraits of past chairmen on the walls. Her acolytes were ecstatic. The cameras drank in the image of Pelosi, triumphant, a slight, predatory curl to her lip. This was the moment designed to lead every newscast, the definitive image of her absolute control. Kennedy let the noise wash over him, his expression as placid as a southern Sunday morning. When the room finally settled, his voice emerged, not as a counterpunch, but as a slow, deliberate drawl that seemed to soak up the room's frantic energy. "Well, Madam Speaker," he began, the words unspooling with a disarming lack of urgency, "that was a truly remarkable piece of political theater, a real five-star production." His eyes drifted down to a single, slender manila folder on the table before him. It was a stark and lonely object compared to the mountains of binders and documents her staff had ostentatiously arranged behind her. He tapped its surface once, a quiet, definitive sound. "You raise an important subject, the subject of ethics." He began to untie the simple string that bound the folder, his fingers moving with an unhurried precision. The ambient chatter in the room began to die down, replaced by an expectant hush. For the first time, a flicker of something other than triumph crossed Pelosi's face, a hairline crack in the marble facade. "I'm not here for your homespun anecdotes, Senator," she snapped, a sharp attempt to reclaim the narrative's momentum. "Oh, this is no anecdote," Kennedy replied, his voice still soft but now underscored with a note of pure, unyielding steel. He slid the folder open. "This is a lesson in accounting, a subject you seem to have mastered, though perhaps not in a way the American people would appreciate." He drew out the first sheet of paper. He did not hold it up for the cameras. He held it up for her. "You speak of puppets and masters. It's an interesting choice of words. Because this document, a financial disclosure form bearing your own signature, suggests that some puppets are exceptionally good at pulling their own strings, especially when those strings are woven from stock market ticker tape." The silence that fell was no longer expectant. It was absolute, heavy, and suffocating. Pelosi's hands, which had been painting pictures of righteous anger in the air just moments before, were now frozen, gripping the lectern. Her knuckles were stark white. The lioness, in mid-pounce, had just heard the distinct sound of a trap snapping shut around her own leg. "Whatever fabricated documents you've brought will not serve as a distraction from the matter at hand," Pelosi retorted, her voice a low growl. But the commanding resonance had been replaced by a brittle, fragile edge. It was a subtle tremor, a faint signal of distress that Kennedy's calm demeanor seemed perfectly calibrated to detect. He looked up from the paper in his hand, his eyebrows arching over his glasses in a display of polite, almost theatrical surprise. "Fabricated, Madam Speaker?" he asked, his tone one of gentle inquiry, as if genuinely puzzled by the accusation. "These are not my creations. They are yours. These are the official financial disclosure reports filed by your own office, as mandated by federal law. The very documents you personally signed, certifying their complete accuracy under penalty of perjury." He leaned forward, his placid smile returning, but it had transformed. It was no longer the smile of a patient man. It was the smile of a chess master who sees the board 10 moves ahead. "Unless, of course, you are now prepared to testify under oath that you knowingly and repeatedly submitted false statements to a committee of the United States Congress. Because that, ma'am, would be a very different and much more serious conversation." A few nervous coughs and stifled chuckles broke the profound silence. The Democratic members of the committee, who had been nodding in vigorous agreement with Pelosi's opening assault, suddenly developed an intense fascination with the intricate patterns of the wood grain on the dais before them. The chairman, a man whose position was a direct result of Pelosi's patronage, began a frantic, purposeless shuffling of his papers, his face a mask of profound and growing discomfort. Kennedy, however, seemed to pay them no mind. His focus was a laser beam, fixed entirely on the woman at the lectern. With the same methodical, unhurried calm, he reached back into the unassuming manila folder and began to retrieve more papers. One by one, he laid them out on the table, creating a neat, ever-expanding stack. Each document was placed with deliberate, almost ceremonial care, perfectly aligned with the one that came before it. The visual itself was a masterpiece of political theater, silent, damning, and utterly relentless. "We have trading records," he murmured, his voice a calm, conversational inventory. "Brokerage statements, entries from your official calendar during your time as speaker, and logs of text messages." He paused, his pale blue eyes, magnified by the lenses of his glasses, locking onto hers once more. "You know, for a public servant so deeply and vocally concerned with the fate of our nation, you have demonstrated a truly astonishing, almost prophetic, ability to predict the future of its stock market." The grand, heroic narrative that Pelosi and her team had spent weeks meticulously constructing was beginning to fray at the edges, unraveling thread by thread. The elaborate trap she had so confidently set for Kennedy was, with each passing second, reconfiguring itself into a cage for her. "This is an outrageous and desperate smear," she attempted again, but the words felt hollow, devoid of their earlier conviction. Her voice was thinner now, the powerful vibrato gone. "Oh, I don't believe it's a smear at all," Kennedy interrupted, his voice still gentle but insistent. "I believe it's simply arithmetic. And the numbers, Madam Speaker, the numbers tell a story of their own." He selected a specific document from the top of the growing pile, holding it at an angle so the C-SPAN cameras could capture a clear view of the highlighted figures. "But before we delve into the mathematics of your, let's call it financial foresight, perhaps we should first clarify for the committee and the American people what it is, precisely, that your husband does for a living." The effect of that seemingly innocuous question was like a sudden drop in atmospheric pressure. In the front row, Pelosi's senior press aide, a woman renowned for her unshakable composure, fumbled her phone, which clattered with an obscene loudness onto the marble floor. Two congressmen seated on the committee, loyal allies just minutes before, abruptly shot to their feet, muttering urgent, overlapping excuses about constituent meetings before making a hasty retreat toward the side doors. In the press gallery, a dozen journalists who had arrived that morning to compose Kennedy's political obituary were now staring at their laptops, their fingers hovering motionless over their keyboards, a collective realization dawning that the real story was not the one they had been sent to cover. Kennedy observed the quiet, panicked exodus with the detached air of a physicist watching a predictable chain reaction. He had introduced a new, unstable element into the carefully balanced equation, and the compound of Pelosi's power was beginning to visibly disintegrate. He turned his gaze back to the former speaker, whose face had transformed in the space of a minute from a mask of righteous fury to that of a cornered animal. "Shall we begin with the NVIDIA trades?" he asked, his voice laced with an almost pleasant academic curiosity. "Or perhaps you prefer to start with the Alliance Bernstein acquisitions. I have the entire day, ma'am. And for me, unlike for some particularly fortunate investors, time is not money. It is simply an opportunity for the truth to find the light." The hunter was now the hunted, and the sharp, metallic scent of fear was beginning to displace the earlier arrogance in the room. Kennedy picked up the first document from his meticulously organized stack. The chamber was so quiet that the rustle of the single sheet of paper sounded like a crack of thunder. "Let's begin with a specific trade from June of 2024, Kennedy started, his voice maintaining its measured, almost academic tone, as if he were a professor leading a seminar. "According to this disclosure, which you signed, your husband exercised a significant number of call options on NVIDIA, purchasing shares valued somewhere between $1 and $5 million. He paused, allowing the sheer scale of the number to settle into the minds of everyone present. A substantial investment for any private citizen, but it is the timing, ma'am, that is truly breathtaking." Pelosi's jaw was a tight, hard line, a muscle twitching just beneath the skin. Her eyes darted towards her legal counsel, a man who could only offer a minute, helpless shrug in response. "My husband is a private citizen," she stated, the words sounding like a pre-rehearsed line from a crisis management playbook, a shield that was already beginning to look flimsy. "He makes his own investment decisions." "Indeed," Kennedy conceded with a slight, agreeable nod. "A very, very prescient private citizen. Because it is a remarkable coincidence, is it not, that he made this massive wager on a semiconductor company just 3 weeks before the final CHIPS Act funding allocations were made public." He reached into his folder and pulled out another document, this one bearing the official seal of the United States Congress. An announcement that, as Speaker Emerita and a key negotiator of that very legislation, you had intimate, advanced knowledge of. A funding package that, to the surprise of many seasoned market analysts, heavily favored NVIDIA. He let the implication hang in the air, thick and unavoidable. A surprise to almost everyone, it would seem, except Mr. Paul Pelosi. A low murmur rippled through the gallery, but this time it was not a sound of support for her. It was a collective hum of shock and dawning comprehension. Several journalists, no longer bothering with subtlety, were already on their feet, slipping out of the room with their phones pressed to their ears, dictating the explosive new headline. "That is pure coincidence," Pelosi insisted, but the word felt hollow, stripped of all its meaning and credibility in the charged atmosphere of the room. "Is it?" Kennedy's voice was gentle, yet relentless. "Well, let's see just how many coincidences we can stack on top of one another before the entire pillar of probability collapses under its own weight." His long, nimble fingers danced over his stack of papers, selecting another exhibit with the confidence of a magician who knows his trick cannot fail. "October 2022. Your husband sells off a massive block of shares in several major tech companies. Google, Amazon." He held up a new document. Just 1 month later, the Department of Justice announces a sweeping, market-shaking antitrust probe into big tech. Another stroke of financial genius, or perhaps just another unbelievably lucky guess. He looked directly at her, his gaze unwavering. "You're cherry-picking a handful of trades to create a false and misleading narrative." AMI Kennedy's smile was thin, sharp as a razor. "All right then, let's not look at the cherries. Let's look at the entire orchard." He reached under the table and with a fluid motion produced a large poster board, a professionally printed chart that he placed on an easel he had apparently set up beside him. It was a stark, brutal visualization of lines and numbers, a story told without words. "This chart," he explained, compares your family's investment portfolio performance to the broader market. The blue line represents the S&P 500, which, as you can see, had a respectable 23% gain in 2024. The green line is Warren Buffett's Berkshire Hathaway, widely considered the gold standard of investing, which gained an impressive 28%. He then used his pen to point to a third line, a jagged, almost vertical ascent colored in a vibrant, aggressive red. And this red line, this is the performance of the portfolio disclosed on your forms. A staggering, almost unbelievable 54% gain. He let the visual sink in, turning from the chart to face the committee and the cameras directly. Now, there are only two possible explanations for this red line. The first is that your husband, Mr. Paul Pelosi, is without question the single greatest investment mind of our generation. A financial oracle who makes Warren Buffett look like a cautious, timid amateur. He paused, his gaze sweeping the room before landing back on Pelosi with devastating focus. The other explanation is that he had help. Before Pelosi could formulate a response, a voice, raw and filled with anguish, erupted from the back of the gallery. "How dare you?" A man shouted, his voice cracking with emotion. But he wasn't looking at Kennedy. He was pointing a trembling finger directly at Nancy Pelosi. How dare she? He was a man in his late 50s, his suit respectable but inexpensive, his face a roadmap of worry and sleepless nights. "I put my son's college fund into the market," he cried out, his voice trembling with a potent mixture of grief and rage. "I listened to the experts on TV, the ones who said to stay the course, and I lost nearly half of it while she was getting rich on secrets none of us are privy to." Security personnel, jolted into action by the outburst, immediately began moving toward him, but Kennedy held up a hand, a gesture of quiet, commanding authority. "Let the gentleman speak," he said, his voice firm, cutting through the rising commotion. "This is a hearing on public ethics. The public should be heard." The chairman, looking flustered and having completely lost control of the proceedings, gave a weak, almost pathetic bang of his gavel. "Order, we must have order." But the man's voice, fueled by a profound sense of personal betrayal, could not be silenced. It commanded the room's attention. "I read about her trades online. There are whole websites, whole communities of people who follow them. Copy the Pelosis and get rich, they say, but you can't, can you?" He asked, his question hanging in the air like a tragic accusation. "Because you don't get the phone calls she gets. You don't sit in the secret meetings where they decide the fate of entire industries." The chairman pleaded, his voice thin and reedy. "Sir, please, you must be seated." "No." The man cried out, his voice breaking under the weight of his despair. "My son can't go to his dream school now. We can't afford it. And she," he pointed again at the frozen, statuesque figure of Nancy Pelosi, "she uses her office to print money for her family while she stands on television and preaches to the rest of us about sacrifice and fairness. It's a rigged game, and she's the one rigging it." Security finally reached him and began to gently but firmly escort him from the chamber. His words, however, remained, hanging in the silent room like a ghost, a powerful testament to the real-world consequences of the abstract numbers on Kennedy's chart. The hearing was no longer about arcane financial regulations. It was about a father's broken promise to his son. Kennedy waited patiently for the commotion to die down, allowing the raw, emotional testimony to settle over the room like a fine layer of dust, coating everything with a film of uncomfortable truth. The outburst had fundamentally shifted the atmosphere, transforming an abstract debate about financial disclosures into a visceral, human story of loss and betrayal. When he spoke again, Kennedy's voice was imbued with a new, somber gravity. "That gentleman," he began, nodding toward the door through which the man had been escorted, "raises a crucial and deeply disturbing point. The public perception of your financial activities has become a cultural phenomenon in itself." He reached back into his manila folder and pulled out a series of printed screenshots, holding them up for the committee and the cameras to see. "This is from a social media account called the Pelosi Stock Tracker. It has over 3 million followers. This is from a financial news site, Nancy's Picks, which analyzes your disclosures as if they were cryptic prophecies from a market oracle. Its articles regularly receive hundreds of thousands of views." He placed the printouts on the ever-growing pile of evidence on his table. "You have become a meme, Madam Speaker, a cultural icon in the world of retail investing. Not for your decades of public service, not for breaking the glass ceiling and becoming the first female Speaker of the House, but for your family's seemingly supernatural, God-like ability to time the market. This is nothing more than character assassination," Pelosi protested, but the accusation sounded weak, a hollow echo of her earlier unshakable confidence. The personal, emotional attack from the gallery had visibly shaken her, striking closer to home than any of Kennedy's calm, factual presentations. "No, ma'am," Kennedy corrected softly, his voice a gentle counterpoint to her strained defensiveness. "This is not character assassination. This is pattern recognition." He began to lay out more documents, his movements fluid and relentless. A slow, methodical assault. Call options on Microsoft, purchased just weeks before they secured a massive, multi-billion-dollar government cloud computing contract. Shares in Broadcom, acquired a month before an unexpected stock split announcement sent the price soaring. A massive short position on certain regional banks, taken just days before you attended a classified Federal Reserve briefing on sector instability. He paused, looking up from his papers to meet her gaze directly. "Your husband doesn't just outperform the market, Madam Speaker. He seems to possess a crystal ball that appears to be tuned directly to the frequency of classified government information." One of the few remaining Democrats on the committee, a younger representative from California named Sarah Chen, cleared her throat, her discomfort palpable. She had the look of someone realizing they were a guest at a dinner party that had just turned into a crime scene. "Senator Kennedy," she began, her voice hesitant and strained, "while this pattern is concerning, surely you are not suggesting that the former speaker is directly involved in—" Kennedy cut her off, not with aggression but with a simple, disarming statement that was somehow more devastating. "I'm not suggesting anything at all, Representative Chen," he said calmly. "I am simply asking questions and presenting publicly available facts." He then pulled another document from his folder, his demeanor shifting slightly, becoming even more serious, the air of academic curiosity replaced by a prosecutor's focus. "Although," he added, his voice dropping, creating a pocket of intense quiet around him, "I do find this particular fact to be more than just concerning." He held up a new document for all to see. "I have here a comparative analysis. On one side, we have the official, classified schedule of congressional leadership briefings that then-Speaker Pelosi attended. On the other, a timeline of her husband's most significant and profitable trades." He let the implication of the two columns hang in the air for a moment, a silent, damning indictment. "It is remarkable," he continued, "how often a multi-million-dollar trade in a specific sector, be it healthcare, defense, or technology, occurs within a 48-hour window of a closed-door, top-secret briefing on that very same sector. Briefings that by law are not to be discussed with anyone, not staff, not friends, and most certainly not spouses." The accusation, though veiled as a simple observation, landed with the force of a physical blow. Pelosi's lead lawyer, a high-priced attorney from a prestigious D.C. firm, shot to his feet. "Senator, that is a baseless and defamatory allegation. You have no foundation for such an insinuation." "You're absolutely right, Counselor," Kennedy agreed with a calm, almost cheerful nod that seemed to infuriate the lawyer even more. "An allegation of that magnitude requires a solid foundation, so let me provide one." He reached into his folder and produced a new set of papers, stapled together. "These are sworn affidavits, calendar cross-references, and most interestingly, text messages." He held up a magnified printout of a single message, its text stark and damning against the white page. It was from Paul Pelosi to a financial advisor. The message was chillingly simple. "Nancy had a long day with the dude. AI is the future. Make the moves." Kennedy looked directly at Pelosi, whose face had gone ghost-white. "This message," he stated, his voice cold and clear, "was sent at 7:48 p.m. on the evening of a classified briefing on the military applications of artificial intelligence. The very next morning, your husband's firm acquired a seven-figure stake in a small, obscure AI defense contractor. A company that, 2 months later, was awarded a sole-source government contract that quintupled its stock price. How did you get my husband's private communications? Pelosi stammered, the words catching in her throat. The question itself was an admission, a confession that such communications existed. Kennedy's smile was gone, replaced by a look of cold, hard gravity. These are not private, ma'am. They were subpoenaed as part of an SEC inquiry. An inquiry, he added, letting each word land with deliberate weight, that was mysteriously and abruptly closed for lack of evidence, just as it was getting interesting. But the evidence, as you can see, never truly disappears. The records always remain. The mention of a closed SEC investigation sent a fresh wave of panic through Pelosi's camp. Her lawyers huddled together, whispering furiously, their faces grim and pale. The carefully constructed defense was crumbling brick by brick, and they were running out of mortar. The exodus of Democrats from the committee room had now become a full-blown rout. Only two remained, looking like shipwreck survivors clinging to a piece of floating wreckage. The gallery, once a source of strength and validation, was now a hostile sea of murmuring and suspicion. Kennedy, seemingly oblivious to the chaos he was orchestrating, continued his methodical dissection, his voice a calm scalpel in the heart of the ensuing panic. "Let us move on to a company called Health Innovate AI, Kennedy said, his voice cutting cleanly through the low buzz of shock and speculation that filled the room. A relatively obscure biotech firm until January of this year. On January 12th, your husband's investment fund purchased a significant block of its shares. At the time, the stock was trading at just over $2 a share. He paused, letting the detail register, painting a picture of a small, speculative bet. Then, in February, something miraculous happened. Health Innovate AI was awarded a massive, exclusive government contract to develop a new AI-driven system for processing Medicare claims. By March, its stock price had skyrocketed to over $30 a share. He picked up a small calculator from the table, slowly and deliberately punching in the numbers in a moment of high, almost cruel theatricality. "By my calculation," he announced, "that's a profit of approximately $1 million on a 2-month investment." Tempest was and is a groundbreaking company, Pelosi countered, her voice strained, grasping for a plausible defense. Its potential was clear to any discerning investor. "Indeed," Kennedy replied, his tone dripping with a heavy, biting irony. "So groundbreaking, in fact, that almost no one else in the market saw its potential. No major investment banks had it on their radar. No prominent tech analysts were recommending it. The only discerning investor, who seemed to grasp its imminent, government-fueled success, was Mr. Paul Pelosi." He then produced another document, this one an internal company email. "I have here an email, obtained legally through a whistleblower, from the CEO of Health Innovate AI to his board of directors. It's dated the day after your husband's investment." He cleared his throat and read from the page. "The Pelosi investment is a game changer. It's a massive vote of confidence. She must know something is coming down the pipeline with the Medicare contract. This is the validation we've been waiting for." Kennedy looked up, his eyes locking onto Pelosi's. "Even the CEO of the company assumed your husband's investment was based on inside information. He saw it as a signal that the fix was in." The room was a tinderbox, and Kennedy was holding a lit match. Her own supporters, the ones who had cheered her entrance just an hour before, were now staring at her with expressions ranging from confusion to outright betrayal. The very foundation of her power, the unwavering loyalty of her followers, was eroding in real time, washed away by a relentless tide of evidence. "But here," Kennedy said, his voice dropping to an almost conspiratorial whisper, drawing everyone in, "is the most telling pattern of all." He pulled out his final document for this section of his presentation. It was not a trading record or an email, but a detailed loss-gain analysis of her family's portfolio stretching back over the past decade. "We have spent a great deal of time discussing your family's remarkable, almost supernatural, successes in the market. But to truly understand the genius at work, one must also analyze the failures." He pointed to a column on the chart. And there have been very, very few. But the ones that do exist are incredibly revealing. Every single significant loss your portfolio has sustained in the last 10 years has occurred in a company that was, within months, placed under federal investigation or subjected to crippling new regulations. He let that statement hang in the air, a profound and damning silence filling the void. You see, ma'am, the real genius here isn't just knowing when to buy, it's knowing when to sell. It's knowing when to get out before the hammer falls. He leaned back in his chair, the very picture of calm, inescapable reason. The American people are not fools. They see a public servant on a government salary amass a personal fortune of over $200 million, and they know the math doesn't work. They see your husband operating his investment fund like a clairvoyant, and they lose what little faith they have left in the integrity of our institutions. The very institutions you swore an oath to protect. I have done nothing illegal, Pelosi declared, the words a desperate cry for shelter in a legalistic foxhole. Legal and ethical are two very different things, Madam Speaker. A distinction I believe you have often lectured your Republican colleagues on. Kennedy shot back instantly, the gentle demeanor gone, replaced by the sharp precision of a prosecutor moving in for the kill. But since you have brought up the law, let's talk about it. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thick, bound document. I have here the sworn deposition of your former chief of staff, a woman who worked by your side for 15 years. Just as he said the words, the large double doors at the back of the hearing room swung open. A woman in her late 50s, her face a mask of grim, unshakable determination, walked purposefully down the center aisle. Pelosi's eyes widened, and for the first time a flicker of genuine, unadulterated fear was visible. The blood drained from her face. She knew this woman, and she knew what this woman knew. "Ah," Kennedy said with perfect, devastating timing. "Speak of the devil. I believe you are acquainted with Ms. Rebecca Martinez. She has quite a story to tell. A story about what really goes on behind closed doors when it's time to file those coincidental trade disclosures." The trap had snapped shut. Rebecca Martinez took her seat at the witness table, her movements calm and deliberate, a stark contrast to the frantic energy radiating from Pelosi's defense team. She did not look at Nancy Pelosi, her former boss and mentor of 15 years. Instead, she stared directly at the committee chairman, her hands folded neatly in front of her on the polished wood. The weight of every camera, every eye in the room was on her, yet she seemed completely composed, a woman who had made a difficult, life-altering decision and was now resolved to see it through. Pelosi, in stark contrast, looked as if she had seen a ghost rise from the grave. Her face, moments before a mask of strained defiance, had crumbled into a portrait of pure shock and betrayal. Her knuckles, already white from gripping the lectern, seemed to strain against the wood as if she might break it. "Ms. Martinez," Kennedy began, his voice softening into a tone of gentle encouragement, as if speaking to a frightened but crucial witness. "You served as Representative Pelosi's chief of staff for 15 years, from 2009 until your resignation in 2024. Is that correct?" "Yes, Senator. It is," Martinez replied, her voice clear and steady, betraying no hint of nervousness. "And could you please tell the committee the reason for your departure after such a long and distinguished tenure?" Martinez took a deep, steadying breath, a moment of final resolve. "I resigned," she said, her words ringing with a conviction that silenced the remaining murmurs in the room, "because I could no longer in good conscience participate in the activities of that office." The room erupted. It wasn't just a murmur this time, it was a collective gasp, a wave of shock that rolled from the press gallery to the public seating. The chairman, jolted into action, began banging his gavel with frantic, ineffective raps. "Order! Order in the hearing. We will have order." But the chaos was not the kind that could be silenced by a gavel. It was the sound of a political dynasty beginning to fracture at its very core. "Objection!" Pelosi's lawyer shouted, scrambling to his feet in a panic. "This is an ambush. This witness has not been properly vetted or scheduled according to committee rules." Kennedy watched the lawyer's frantic display with an air of mild amusement. "Counselor," he observed calmly, "Ms. Martinez worked intimately with your client for a decade and a half. If that's not being vetted, I'm not sure what is." Ignoring the sputtering lawyer, Kennedy turned back to the witness. Tell us about the process for ensuring compliance with the Stock Act in the Speaker's office. Martinez gave a short, mirthless laugh that was more chilling than any accusation. There was no process, she said bluntly. Not a real one. Oh, we filed the disclosure forms. Absolutely. Usually at the last possible minute, often late on a Friday before a holiday weekend to minimize press coverage. But the spirit of the law, the idea of preventing conflicts of interest, that was treated as a joke, a nuisance. Rebecca, how could you? The words escaped Pelosi's lips as a wounded whisper, a desperate personal plea from a queen to a disloyal subject. For the first time, Martinez turned her head and looked directly at her former boss. The expression on her face was not one of anger but of profound, sorrowful disappointment. How could I, Nancy? She asked, her voice quiet, yet carrying with devastating clarity to every corner of the silent room. I watched you deliver passionate speeches on the House floor about the need to root out corruption, and then walk back to your private office to review Paul's latest stock acquisitions before a big vote. I was the one who had to schedule your mandatory ethics in government seminars on the same day I was instructed to delay filing a disclosure on a multi-million-dollar tech trade. I did it for years because I believed in you. I believed in the image, but I couldn't do it anymore. My conscience wouldn't let me. Kennedy allowed the powerful, personal testimony to hang in the air, a moment of pure, unscripted drama that no screenwriter could have crafted. Then he gently guided the proceedings back to the hard facts. Ms. Martinez, can you tell the committee about the events of December 22nd, 2023, the Friday before Christmas? Martinez recalled instantly, the memory clearly seared into her mind. I was instructed to file 4 major trade disclosures at exactly 4:52 p.m. It was a classic document dump. The trades were all 7-figure purchases of semiconductor stocks. And what was the significance of those particular stocks? Kennedy prompted, leading her through the narrative. They were all companies that were designated as primary beneficiaries in the second round of funding for the CHIPS Act, she explained, the final list of which had been confirmed in a classified leadership briefing that very morning. She reached into her own briefcase and pulled out a folder, a mirror image of Kennedy's own methodical approach. I started keeping my own copies of everything a few years ago, she said, her voice heavy with regret. I think deep down, I always knew a day like this would come. The press gallery was in a state of pandemonium. This was no longer just a story about suspicious trades. It was a first-hand account of a conspiracy to defraud the public, coming from the very heart of the operation itself. But that wasn't the worst of it, Martinez continued, her voice dropping, pulling the room into an even deeper state of shock. The worst part was how she used her power over committee assignments. Kennedy leaned forward, his interest visibly piqued. This was new territory. Please explain that to the committee, Ms. Martinez. She would place herself or her most loyal allies on committees and subcommittees that oversaw the very sectors where Paul was heavily invested, Martinez stated, her words precise and damning. She sat on committees dealing with healthcare policy while he was actively trading pharmaceutical and biotech stocks. She influenced the antitrust subcommittee while he was making massive bets on tech mergers and acquisitions. She didn't just have access to inside information. She was the architect of the very regulatory environment she was profiting from. That is a despicable lie. Pelosi shouted, her voice raw and cracking, the sound of pure desperation. Is it? Martinez shot back, her sorrowful demeanor hardening into one of cold fury. She pulled out a small, leather-bound calendar. February 12, 2023. You attended a closed-door briefing with senior FDA officials about the accelerated approval timeline for a new Alzheimer's drug from Biogen. February 14, 2 days later, Paul bought $1 million in Biogen call options. April 20th, the drug's accelerated approval was officially announced. The stock jumped 40%. Profit, $18 million. Each date, each number, was another nail being hammered into the coffin of Pelosi's legacy. Rebecca, please don't do this, Pelosi pleaded, her voice cracking, the desperate appeal for a personal connection a stark admission of how far the proceedings had spun out of her control. But Martinez was unmoved. a woman on a mission fueled by years of suppressed guilt and a rediscovered conscience. She continued, her voice a relentless metronome of accusation. March 28, 2023. You chaired a confidential banking committee meeting discussing the potential for contagion after the collapse of Silicon Valley Bank. March 30th, Paul bought put options, a bet that the stock would go down, against First Republic Bank. May 1st, First Republic failed and was seized by federal regulators. Profit, $31 million. The litany of dates and profits was devastating, painting a picture not of random luck or shrewd investing, but of a calculated, systematic exploitation of power. The room was thick with the stench of corruption. A senior Democratic congressman, a longtime Pelosi ally and friend, suddenly stood up, his face pale and clammy. He didn't offer an excuse or a word. He simply turned and hurried out of the room. Two more followed in his wake. The political lifeboats were being launched and the rats were abandoning the sinking ship. "How many times, Ms. Martinez?" Kennedy asked, his voice a quiet, somber bass note in the funereal atmosphere. How many trades like this were there? Martinez shook her head slowly, the weight of the answer visible on her face. "Hundreds," she replied, her voice barely a whisper. "Over the years, hundreds. If you include all the smaller trades, the ones under the reporting threshold that we didn't have to disclose, it could be thousands. It was the system. It was just how things were done." She looked up, her eyes finding Kennedy's, a silent plea for him to understand the totality of it. There was even a shorthand for it, a code. If a staffer was asked to research a particular company for a friend of the family, we all knew that meant it was a stock Paul was looking at. It was our signal that a policy decision or some piece of inside information was about to make it move. The phrase "friend of the family" hung in the air, a chillingly mob-like euphemism that stripped away the final veneer of respectability and public service. Pelosi, seeing the utter devastation, tried one last desperate gambit, a classic political counterpunch. "Senator Kennedy," she began, trying to muster the last dregs of her old authority, "let's not pretend you're some kind of saint. Let's talk about your own donors. The fossil fuel industry has poured millions into your campaigns." "They certainly have," Kennedy agreed instantly, his cheerful concession disarming the attack before it could even land. "And I'm proud of their support. They are major employers in my home state of Louisiana, and every single donation is publicly disclosed in accordance with the law." He leaned forward, his voice becoming sharp and incisive. "What I have never done, ma'am, is take a single dollar from a donor and then use information from a classified briefing to personally enrich myself with a stock trade in their company. Can you honestly stand there before this committee and the American people and say the same?" The counterattack had not only failed, it had backfired spectacularly, highlighting the very distinction between legal, transparent fundraising and the alleged corruption he was exposing. Pelosi slumped, the fight visibly draining out of her, leaving an empty, haggard shell. But Kennedy was not finished. He reached for a new, brightly colored folder, this one marked with a single word: Vineyard. "Since we're on the subject of ethics and hypocrisy," he continued, his voice hardening, shedding its last pretense of gentility, "let's discuss your passionate, career-long fight for a higher minimum wage." A low groan went through the gallery. Some of them knew what was coming. It was a story that had circulated for years in conservative media, a persistent rumor that had never managed to break through the mainstream firewall that Pelosi's immense power had maintained. That firewall was now gone, reduced to ash. "You have been the most vocal champion of the fight for 15, demanding a $15 an hour federal minimum wage," Kennedy stated, pulling out transcripts of her speeches from the folder. "You've called it a moral imperative, a matter of basic human dignity." He then pulled out another set of documents, payroll records. "Meanwhile, at the sprawling vineyard in Napa Valley, the one your husband owns but from which you derive significant financial benefit, the agricultural workers who toil in the fields are paid." He paused for dramatic effect, pretending to squint at the fine print. "Ah, here it is. $12.50 an hour." The hypocrisy was so stark, so blatant, that it drew audible gasps from the press corps. "And that's not all," Kennedy continued, his voice now laced with a cold, righteous anger. "They receive no health benefits. no paid overtime, and a significant portion of the workforce consists of temporary guest workers on H-2A visas, workers who cannot complain about their wages or conditions without facing the immediate threat of deportation. Those are standard agricultural wages for that region, Pelosi stammered, a weak, technical defense against a powerful moral indictment. Standard. Kennedy's voice rose for the first time, shedding its calm exterior to reveal a core of pure fury. The woman who lectures the entire country about the necessity of a living wage pays her own workers poverty wages. The self-proclaimed champion of American labor uses foreign visa programs to undercut American workers. There is nothing standard about that level of hypocrisy, ma'am. He then pulled out a series of large, glossy photographs and placed them one by one on the easel, replacing the financial chart. They showed cramped, dilapidated housing units, little more than sheds. "These were taken last week," he said, his voice low and intense. "This is where your vineyard's workers live, 8 men to a single room, while you and your husband reside in your $25 million estate just a few miles down the road." The visual contrast was brutal, a modern-day tale of feudal lords and serfs. The carefully crafted image of Nancy Pelosi, woman of the people, was being systematically torn to shreds before a national audience. The images of the squalid workers housing hung in the room, a silent, damning indictment. The air crackled with a new kind of anger, one that transcended political affiliation and touched upon a more fundamental sense of fairness. Suddenly, a woman in the gallery shot to her feet, her face flushed with rage. She wasn't a plant or an activist. She was a well-known Democratic donor from San Francisco, a fixture in Pelosi's own social circle. She held a fundraiser there. The woman shouted, her voice trembling with indignation. "I was there. $50,000 a plate to listen to her talk about income inequality and workers' rights. And the people serving us the canapés, they were the very people she was exploiting." Security guards began moving toward her, but her outburst had opened the floodgates. Others stood up, their voices joining hers in a chorus of betrayal. The meticulously curated wall of support had not just cracked, it had transformed into an angry mob. The people who had once formed the bedrock of her power base were now turning on her, their adoration curdled into contempt. Kennedy let the chaos swell for a moment before turning back to the witness at the table. His voice cut cleanly through the din. "Ms. Martinez," he said, "while we are on the topic of labor practices in the Congresswoman's office itself, can you tell us about the intern program?" Martinez nodded grimly. "It was one of the most sought-after internships on Capitol Hill. We had hundreds of applicants for just a few spots every semester." "And what was the compensation for these full-time interns?" Kennedy asked. "There was no compensation," Martinez replied flatly. "It was unpaid. They worked 40, sometimes 50 hours a week doing substantive work, research, drafting memos, constituent services for free. Many of them had to take on second jobs waiting tables at night just to afford to live in D.C. She shook her head in disgust. "And all the while, she would be out on the campaign trail, giving speeches about economic justice and the exploitation of young people." The committee room was now in a state of complete meltdown. The chairman was banging his gavel, but it was a futile gesture, like trying to stop a tidal wave with a teaspoon. His shouts for order were drowned out by the angry crosstalk from the gallery and the frantic movements of staffers and reporters. Pelosi stood frozen at the lectern, a solitary, statuesque figure watching her world burn down around her. The woman who had orchestrated every detail of this hearing was now a helpless spectator at her own immolation. "Order, order," the chairman yelled, his voice cracking. "This committee will take a 15-minute recess." The announcement was a mercy. As the room emptied in a chaotic exodus, Kennedy calmly organized his papers. He had more folders, many more. He was just getting started. When the committee reconvened, the scene was one of utter devastation for the Pelosi camp. The section of the dais reserved for the Democratic members was now a ghost town, with only the beleaguered chairman and the conflicted-looking Representative Chen remaining. Nancy Pelosi returned to the lectern, but she was a changed woman. The defiant posture was gone, replaced by a fragile, haggard weariness. She was now flanked by 2 new, grim-faced lawyers who looked like they had been summoned from a corporate crisis management firm, that specialized in political disasters. Kennedy waited for the room to settle, a predator allowing his prey a moment to catch its breath before the final chase. He then reached for a folder he had labeled Foreign Interests, opening it with the same deliberate, unhurried motion that had become his signature. "Representative Pelosi," he began, his voice once again calm and measured, "let us broaden our discussion. Let's talk about your family's fascinating and highly profitable relationship with foreign capital." "I have never accepted a single dollar from a foreign government," Pelosi stated immediately, a reflexive, practiced denial. "Please, ma'am, allow me to finish," Kennedy interjected gently. "I did not say accepted. I said relationship. The distinction is important." He pulled out a document covered in yellow highlighter. "Are you familiar with an entity known as the Al-Thani Foundation?" Pelosi's new lawyers immediately went into a panicked huddle. She stared blankly at Kennedy, saying nothing. "It's a simple question," Kennedy pressed. "The Al-Thani Foundation, a multi-billion-dollar nonprofit ostensibly dedicated to educational initiatives. It also happens to be directly controlled by the ruling family of Qatar. The foundation funds legitimate programs," one of the new lawyers interjected. "Indeed, it does," Kennedy agreed. "And it also, according to these bank records, provided Mr. Paul Pelosi's investment firm with over $8 million in consulting fees between 2019 and 2023. He held up the records. "A curious arrangement, given your influential role on the House Foreign Affairs Committee during those exact years." The reporters still in the room began typing with renewed ferocity. "But the payments themselves are not the most interesting part," Kennedy continued. "The interesting part is the noticeable shift in your public rhetoric regarding Qatar's human rights record, a shift that aligns perfectly with the timeline of these payments. In 2018, before the fees began, you said, and I quote, 'Qatar's abysmal treatment of migrant workers is a stain on the conscience of the world.' In 2021, after your husband's firm had received over $4 million, you praised Qatar for making significant and laudable progress. My question, ma'am, is simple. What changed? The reality for those workers or the balance in your husband's bank account? That is a disgusting smear." The lawyer shouted, "Is it?" Kennedy countered. "When a foreign government pays the spouse of a senior lawmaker millions of dollars, that is not a smear. That is a foreign influence operation." He tossed the Qatar documents onto the pile. "But Qatar, it seems, was just an appetizer. Let's move on to the main course. Let's talk about China." Pelosi physically stiffened. "Your trip to Taiwan in August of 2022, Kennedy began, his tone thick with sarcasm. It was hailed as a courageous act of defiance. What the glowing headlines failed to mention was the flurry of trading activity in your husband's accounts in the weeks leading up to it. He laid out trade confirmations, massive new positions in semiconductor manufacturers, huge investments in defense contractors, a portfolio perfectly positioned to profit from a sudden spike in geopolitical tensions in the Taiwan Strait. My visit was a statement in support of a Democratic ally," Pelosi insisted. "Your visit was a catalyst for a portfolio windfall," Kennedy corrected her sharply. "Your taxpayer-funded trip, which brought the world to the brink of a major conflict, also happened to generate an estimated $8 million in profit for your family." A wave of audible gasps swept through the room. The story had just crossed a new threshold, from greed to something bordering on treason. "But here is where the hypocrisy becomes truly breathtaking," Kennedy continued, his voice low and intense. "While you were performing your public role as China's #1 critic, your husband was quietly and deeply invested in the very Chinese companies you were condemning. He produced records for an offshore shell company, ByteDance, the parent company of TikTok, an app you have repeatedly called a threat to our national security. Your husband's offshore entity held a $25 million stake, which he conveniently sold just weeks before you called for a congressional investigation. Another lucky guess, I presume." Pelosi's face was a mask of translucent white. Her lawyers shuffled papers with the frantic, useless energy of men trying to plug a dam with their bare hands. "The pattern is sickeningly consistent," Kennedy declared, his voice rising. "Public condemnations that move markets, followed by private trades that capitalize on those movements. It is a symphony of corruption. These were legal investments, Pelosi whispered. So was the Louisiana Purchase, Kennedy retorted. Doesn't make it right when you're on both sides of the deal. Enough. Pelosi suddenly screamed, the sound shocking in its raw, animal desperation. This is McCarthyism. Normal. Kennedy's voice was incredulous. Ma'am, normal people do not have their spouses receiving millions from foreign adversaries, while they write the laws that affect those adversaries. Normal people do not turn a global crisis they helped create into a personal profit center. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out his most devastating weapon yet, a document with a stark red, classified stamp, now crossed out with the word DCLASSAFIED. This, he announced, is a report from the FBI's Counterintelligence Division. They have been tracking foreign attempts to compromise members of Congress. Your husband's name appears 17 times, not as a victim, ma'am, but as what they chillingly refer to as a person of interest, a potential vector for foreign influence. That's classified information. One of the lawyers blurted out, an instinctive reaction that was an immediate catastrophic mistake. Not anymore, Kennedy said calmly, a thin, predatory smile playing on his lips. It was declassified last week, but it's very interesting that you knew of its existence, counselor. He let that sink in. Did you know the FBI recommended a full-scale investigation into your family's foreign financial entanglements? Did you know that investigation was quashed by senior political appointees at the Department of Justice? I have the memos for that as well. The chairman, looking physically ill, finally spoke up. Senator Kennedy, this is not the proper forum. With all due respect, Mr. Chairman, Kennedy cut him off, his voice ringing with authority. This is the House Ethics Committee. If we cannot address this here, then what is the point of this committee's existence? He turned back to Pelosi, his eyes cold as granite. It's time to talk about how you've gotten away with all of this for so long. He held up a thick, bound volume. I have here the sworn testimonies of 6 former staffers, 2 SEC investigators, and 1 very cooperative former business partner of your husband. They all tell the same story. A story of intimidation, of careers ruined, of threats, and of a machine built to protect your empire at all costs. He then produced a small tablet. But the most powerful testimony comes from a man you trusted implicitly, a man who knows where every single body is buried because he helped you dig the graves. He pressed play. The face of a man in his 60s, his features partially shadowed, appeared on the screen. My name is David Thornton, the man said, his voice steady. For 20 years, I was Paul Pelosi's business partner, and I am here to tell you how Nancy Pelosi turned public service into a criminal enterprise. The room went dead silent. Pelosi stared at the screen, her mouth agape in horror. The video continued. Every trade was planned. Nancy would come home from a briefing, and Paul would be on the phone with our broker within the hour. They had codes. The weather is changing meant sell. We're planting a new garden meant buy. I have the recordings. I have the emails. I have 2 decades of proof. Kennedy paused the video. Why? Pelosi croaked, her voice a dry rasp. Why would he do this to us? Kennedy's face hardened. Because you destroyed his daughter, he said, his voice laced with ice. She was a whistleblower at the FDA. She tried to expose malfeasance at a pharmaceutical company your husband was heavily invested in. Your office made the calls that got her blacklisted, investigated, and driven into bankruptcy. He decided it was time for justice. Kennedy stood up, gathering his papers. You once said, no one is above the law. Do you still believe that, ma'am? Pelosi stood silently, broken. Your reign is over, Kennedy said as he walked toward the door. The only question left is how many years you'll spend in prison. He walked out, leaving behind the smoldering ruins of a political dynasty. The truth had finally won. If you were as shocked by this story as we were, and you believe that our leaders must be held to a higher standard, then smash that like button. Subscribe to this channel for more deep dives that the mainstream media won't touch, and hit the notification bell so you never miss an investigation. The fight for transparency is far from over, and we need you with us every step of the way.